The oil embargo of 1973-74, energy weaponization, geopolitical transformation, and the restructuring of global power. Introduction: the strategic weaponization of energy. The oil embargo of 1973-1974 represents one of the most consequential episodes in modern economic history, where a natural resource was conscientiously transformed into an instrument of geopolitical leverage. The crisis demonstrated that control over energy supply could alter global power hierarchies more rapidly than military conquest or financial coercion. Oil-producing states, particularly those with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries (OPEC), revealed that industrial economies were structurally dependent on imported hydrocarbons. This dependency produced a strategic asymmetry, allowing relatively smaller producers to exert disproportionate influence over global macroeconomic stability. Inflation trajectories and foreign policy alignment. The embargo exposed vulnerabilities embedded in the post-World War II economic growth models that relied heavily on cheap and abundant oil. Industrial expansion, suburbanization, global trade logistics, and mass consumer culture had been built upon the assumption of stable energy access. The sudden disruption of this assumption triggered cascading economic dislocations, forcing policymakers to reconsider energy security as a core component of national sovereignty. Historical context: the Yom Kippur War and the global geopolitical trigger. The immediate catalyst for oil embargo was the geopolitical confrontation known as the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated military offensive against Israel on October 2, 1973, seeking to regain territories lost during the Six Days War of 1967. The United States responded by providing military and logistical support to Israel, including the large-scale airlift of weapons and supplies. Arab oil-producing states interpreted this support as direct intervention in the regional balance of power. In response, Arab members of OPEC, particularly Saudi Arabia, implemented a strategic embargo on oil exports to the United States and several Western allies. Production cuts were introduced incrementally, reducing output by approximately 5% per month. The objective was not merely economic retaliation but political coercion designed to alter Western foreign policy towards the Middle East conflict. The embargo demonstrated the emergence of resource nationalism as a political doctrine. Oil was no longer merely a commodity, it had become a diplomatic instrument capable of influencing alliances, military decisions, and long term geopolitical strategy. OPEC and the shift in control over global energy markets. The crisis fundamentally altered the structure of the global oil industry. Prior to the embargo, Western multinational oil corporations exercised substantial operational control over extraction, refining, and distribution networks across the Middle East. These corporations functioned as intermediaries between producing states and consuming economies, capturing significant share of revenue while limiting the sovereign influence of resource-rich nations. Following the embargo, producing countries accelerated efforts to nationalize their oil industries. Control shifted from private Western firms to state-owned enterprises, dramatically increasing the political and fiscal autonomy of oil-producing nations. Revenue surged as oil prices quadrupled within a short period, transferring unprecedented wealth into Middle Eastern economies. The redistribution of wealth enabled oil exporters to invest in domestic infrastructure, welfare system, and industrial diversification. At the same time, it increased their capacity to shape international diplomacy through sovereign wealth funds, bilateral investment agreements, and strategic alliances. The transformation of ownership structures within the oil industry marked the beginning of a new global energy regime characterized by heightened state involvement and strategic resource management. Economic shockwaves, inflation, stagflation, and structural adjustments. The immediate economic consequence of the embargo was severe. Oil prices rose dramatically, triggered inflationary pressure across industrialized economies. Since petroleum products were integral inputs in transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and electricity generation, the price shock transmitted rapidly across supply chains. Western economies experienced a phenomenon known as stagflation, characterized by simultaneous economic stagnation and high inflation. Traditional Keynesian policy tools proved inadequate because measures designed to stimulate economic growth risked exacerbating inflationary pressure, while anti-inflationary measures threatened to deepen recessionary conditions. Government implemented various interventions including fuel rationing, price controls, and consumption restrictions. Long queues at gasoline stations became symbol of strategic vulnerability. Consumers began to reassess energy efficiencies, leading to structural change in automobile design, urban planning, and industrial production processes. The crisis demonstrated that energy costs function as a fundamental driver of macroeconomic stability. Inflation expectations became closely tied to oil price volatility, reinforcing the strategic importance of energy independence in economic planning. Technological adaptation and the search for energy alternatives. The embargo catalyzed technological innovation and diversification within the global energy sector. Industrialized nations accelerated investments in alternative energy sources, including nuclear power, natural gas, and renewable technologies such as wind and solar energy. Research and development expenditures increased significantly as policymakers sought to reduce vulnerability to external supply disruptions. Energy efficiency emerged as a central policy objective. Governments introduced fuel economy standards designed to reduce consumption per unit of economic output. Automobile manufacturers responded by producing smaller and more efficient vehicles, particularly in Japan, where engineers' innovation aligned with emerging market demand. Oil exploration expanded into previously uneconomical regions, including offshore fields in North America and Arctic territories. These investments increased global supply diversity, gradually reducing OPEC's relative dominance in global oil markets. The crisis thus functioned as a catalyst for technological transformation, illustrating how economic shocks can accelerate structural innovation within strategic industries. Geopolitical consequences. The emergence of energy security doctrine. Energy security became a central part of national strategic planning following the embargo. Governments recognized that economic sovereignty requires stable access to energy resources. Strategic petroleum reserves were established to mitigate future supply disruptions. Diplomatic engagement with oil-producing nations intensified, reflecting the recognition that energy relationships were inseparable from foreign policy. The crisis also influenced military strategy. Securing maritime routes, pipelines, and energy infrastructure became essential components of national defense doctrine. Energy transit choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz gained increased geopolitical significance due to their role in facilitating global oil flows. The embargo reinforced the perception that economic warfare could be conducted through supply chain manipulation rather than conventional military confrontation. Resource control emerged as a critical dimension of geopolitical competition. Long-term structural effects on the global economy. The long-term effects of the global embargo extended beyond immediate economic disruption. The crisis reshaped global trade patterns, industrial priorities, and international financial flows. Petrodollar recycling became a central feature of global finance, as oil exporting nations reinvested surplus revenues into Western banking systems and government securities. Oil importing nations pursued diversification strategies aiming to reduce reliance on single suppliers. Energy intensity per unit of GDP declined significantly, reflecting improvements in efficiency and technological adaptation. Over time, the global economy became less vulnerable to single source energy shocks, although dependence on hydrocarbon remained substantial. Global oil production expanded significantly, rising from less than 60 million barrels per day in 1973 to approximately 94 million barrels per day by 2022. This increase reflected both technological progress and strategic investment in energy infrastructure. Despite diversification efforts, oil retained its position as a dominant energy source, underscoring the persistent structural importance of hydrocarbons in modern economic systems. Energy weaponization in the contemporary world. Strategic, the strategic logic demonstrated during the embargo continues to influence contemporary geopolitics. Resource producing states remain capable of exerting influence through supply manipulation, pricing strategies, and export restrictions. Energy interdependence creates complex strategic relationships in which producers and consumers are simultaneous competitors and partners. Recent geopolitical conflicts have illustrated the continuing relevance of energy leverage. Supply disruptions linked to regional conflicts have generated volatility in energy markets, reinforcing the importance of diversification and strategic reserves. The transition towards renewable energy sources may gradually reduce the geopolitical significance of oil, but new dependencies are emerging around critical minerals required for renewable technologies. Lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements may function as strategic resources analogous to oil during the 20th century. Energy transition thus alter rather than eliminate the geopolitical importance of resource control. Conclusion: structural lessons from the oil embargo. The oil embargo of 1973-74 demonstrated that economic systems built upon concentrated resource dependencies are inherently vulnerable to strategic disruptions. The crisis revealed the extent to which industrial prosperity depends upon securing supply chains, predictable commodity prices. The embargo transformed the relationship between energy and power, establishing a precedent for the use of economic instruments as a tool of geopolitical influence. It accelerated technological innovation, reshaped global trade relationships, and altered the distribution of wealth between producing and consuming nations. The structural lesson is that control over essential inputs confers disproportionate influence within the international system. Energy security, therefore, is not merely an economic concern but a central determinant of geopolitical stability. The oil crisis illustrated that the architecture of global power is shaped not only by military capabilities or by financial capital but also by the strategic control of resources upon which the modern civilization depends upon.